Sound like they're on. Yep, there we go. There we go. Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. This is our third and final plenary discussion to the conference, The Social Practice of Human Rights. This conversation, in part, I hope, builds on the initial plenary discussion. Well, I hope many of you were there for the keynote address by Opal Tometi, then a plenary discussion that we had on social and political movements. Then last night we discussed technical innovation and new technologies and what are the implications for the human rights movement there. And here we're circling towards a question about what is going on in terms of the demand or the actual transformation in our ecological and economic systems, both domestically and globally. And what does that mean from a human rights perspective, or does the human rights framework add something to that? What are other frameworks adding to this question about transformation in the eco-economic sphere? And what are the funding type implications? And tonight we will hear from someone from Anand, who has written a book really challenging the philanthropic sector, which is a major part of, as you all know, those of you who work in human rights and development, you all know that philanthropic efforts drive a lot of and incentivize a lot of our work, and we rely on it. But it also stems and feeds into particular systems. This year's SPHR is about how does human rights, which is a normative framework, grapple with systems change in part, and what are the types of innovations that are happening that can help to increase human rights globally. So we have an amazing panel. It's a discussion that I'd like to get you all involved in, but we're going to start by letting our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll have a bit of a conversation that I will try and facilitate, and then we will open it up for questions. I am neither an environmental expert, a climate expert, nor an economist, or so I have none of the positionality to be up here at all, but I am very interested in this conversation, and particularly honored that I have my former colleague here, JD Cruz from UNDP, who is the brain behind UNDP's current global strategy. So very pleased to have JD here with me, and other panelists. Hans-Ott Sano, who is our representative of the traditional human rights world, coming from the Danish Institute of Human Rights, which is one of the most globally renowned human rights quasi-NGO, sort of government and NGO players in the global sphere. We have Lyle Scruggs, who comes to us from UConn, and those of you who know the human rights in the US world know that UConn is generating lots of great thinkers, and has Shireen Hertel and other great thought leaders in the human rights world, particularly on the economic, social, and cultural rights area. And while Lyle is a political scientist, he does all his political science work around climate and economic questions. And then we have Trishala Deb from Thousand Currents, which is, I think, arguably the most innovative grant-making foundation to date, particularly in the environmental, climate, and economic sphere. So an extraordinary panel. Please take the opportunity to ask them whatever questions you have. These are complicated issues. These are big, far-reaching issues. We started the social and economic panel, the social and political movements panel, for those of you who are here, with Rafa from Amnesty, although he couldn't be speaking for Amnesty when he said this, but from the indigenous community's perspective, the problem is capitalism, the problem is the global economic system. The indigenous way of life brings a totally different perspective that is being basically destroyed, and how do we as rights actors who have often been implicated, and where the critiques come from many directions of the human rights effort, has been implicated in sort of the spread of neoliberal capitalist type models integrated with democratic governance and rights and human right and rule of law thinking. So that's a challenge to us, and we, of course, that economic system gets much of its energy, so to speak, from extracting greatly, particularly in the global south, of natural resources and destroying in large part ecosystems around the world. And we have right now arguably one of the largest, if not the largest existential crisis to humanity. And human rights is human-centered. It does require humanity, which is climate change. So we're going to try and tackle that all. I'm going to look to you guys because you're more the experts than I am. But I'm going to start by letting Hans-Ott talk a little bit from the economic inequalities and economic and social rights perspective. Hans-Ott, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm a research director at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Denmark is a small country. We are not used to addressing global systemic change. We maybe tend to think a little more modestly about what we can accomplish as a small country, but nevertheless, we are engaged in these discussions. That's true. So I have a research project on poverty and human rights, and I'm currently contributing to a book to be published on poverty, and I'm partly going to speak on that subject with respect to Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. I've done research on rural areas in Ghana and in slum areas in Bangladesh. I'm also involved in a research project on realizing the SDGs, the role of responsible business. We are doing that with partners in respectively Ghana and Kenya. And then I'm heading a research project on human rights and economic growth, which is maybe in this context a little bit of a suspicious project. But we nevertheless think it's interesting. So on poverty decline in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the World Bank, using the 1.90 US dollar per day per person, will have a figure on poverty in 2015 of 41%. Whereas in 1990, when we started the Millennium Development Goals, the head count was at 57%, so from 57 to 41%. More people in Sub-Saharan Africa are poor today than in 1990. So the population growth has surpassed the fall in poverty. But the World Bank has also a non-monetary estimate of poverty today, which says that poverty around 2013 was 64%. So much higher than the 41%. And this non-monetary measure is established by including access to health, access to education, and access to basic infrastructure like sanitation and water. So in a way, the non-monetary measure of the World Bank is also coming closer to a human rights measurement of poverty. But we don't have comparative figures over a long period of time. So let's take some estimates of poverty. For instance, if we use this World Bank 1.90 figure. In Ethiopia, we get a rate of poverty of 27%. In Niger, in West Africa, we get a rate of poverty of 44%. But if we use what is called the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative figure on poverty in Ethiopia, we get a figure of 83.5% of the population. So compared to the World Bank measurement, the 1.90 measurement of poverty, the Oxford poverty measurement rates the level much higher. So poverty has not fallen as much as the international financial institutions would traditionally argue. So when we include human rights-based measures like the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative has also element of access to education, access to health, and living standards. So in a way, it's closer to a human rights measurement. And when we include human rights measurement into the equation, we get a higher rate of poverty for Ethiopia and also for Niger, which I've used as another example. In all the cases, there's a strong difference between urban poverty and rural poverty. The rural poverty is much higher than in urban areas. Okay, so I have 4 to 5 points on these issues. A human rights-based measurement of poverty implies that the Millennium Development Goals assessment of poverty should be reassessed, because it's not accurate if you include a human rights perspective. And the interesting thing is that there's no question that the human rights discourse has influenced the measurement of poverty, in the sense that the World Bank has started to include non-monetary thinking into its reporting. My question also in the research I've been doing was, how does the fall in poverty, however, at what level, how does it fall in poverty relate to a human rights-based approach? Is it human rights? Is it social movements in Sub-Saharan Africa which has influenced the fall in poverty? And I don't find any evidence on that. This is not the explanation. So in a way, I don't see the documentation that human rights-based efforts have had a very strong impact on these poverty levels. Generally, I miss research that elucidates the transformative potential of human rights in the African context. I don't think we have a lot on that. And we have assumed, when we started to talk within the UN about a human rights-based approach, we would also talk about, addressing the root causes of poverty. But, Joe, you must explain us.
Well,
and a broader point on human rights research in Africa, I think evidence on social transformation is difficult to get. When human rights analysis of social transformation in African countries is difficult to get, maybe with the exception of South Africa. Quite a lot of focus on and quite a lot of human rights studies in South Africa, but in other countries, I don't really find it. So in a way, I also think, and when I'm looking at scientific journals, I think that Sub-Saharan Africa is in a way under-researched when you look at it with a human rights lens. And that's also important for the issues that we are addressing.
Thank you. So, multidimensional poverty being a very different metric when you take into account all forms of poverty-related needs, right? So health, education, livelihood. So when we look at multidimensional poverty, and if you look at that from a human rights lens, it's economic, social, cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. It can be quite extraordinary to see the level of deprivation. But there's also the environmental dimensions, and maybe Lyle, you can talk a little bit about how your work looks at other forms, energy poverty and other forms of current environmentally related poverty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you guys for coming out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate inequality, hopefully relatively quickly. Talk a little bit about some ways to address that in the current environment. Unfortunately, that means that it's sort of expensive, a lot more expensive for us than we might have anticipated. So you may be familiar with maps of climate vulnerability globally. They tend to show that most of the people or most of the regions who are most likely to be affected, who are the least resilient to looming climate change, both in the recent past and over the next 50 to 100 years, are the most vulnerable populations in terms of poverty, high levels of poverty. You can think about it more or less running closer to the equator. Countries that are closer to the equator are in worse shape or more vulnerable. They, from a justice perspective, played very little role other than perhaps having resources extracted from them in causing the problems of increasing CO2 emissions and other forms of emissions that cause climate change. So there's a large inequality and with that an injustice between the perpetrators of, we could call them the perpetrators of climate change, and the victims or the soon-to-be victims. It turns out that that kind of inequality maps reasonably to the distribution of climate risk just in the United States. In the mid-2000s or mid-2010s, somehow this slipped out of the Trump administration's Environmental Protection Agency. Some consultants published a report in late 2017 that broke down climate resiliency and vulnerability by county across the country. A map of that would show you that the regions that are most vulnerable, the counties that are most vulnerable and the least resilient to climate change are not the ones that we tend to think of as being most likely to get the impact, the coastal areas. Those areas are quite rich and often have a lot of institutional support or institutions and resources to combat that. They tend to be places that are high poverty counties. If you look through Appalachia, if you look through the Deep South, certain counties in the Deep South, you can see that those counties are more vulnerable. Again, if we think historically, for the most part, the counties that are the most vulnerable are the ones who historically have consumed probably the fewest within the United States resources. If we think about it internationally, we think about those inequalities, it points to what you might be able to see in the first slide. I can see it. I don't know whether you can see it from the monitors over there. And that's, no, if you could actually back up to the first one, sorry. I sort of went out of order. Thanks. So what this shows you is the number of people or percentage of population in several regions that actually have access to electricity at all, right? And what I would like for you to compare is that block of white space at the top relative to that, I think it's green or gray space, which is the rough proportional size of the North American population and the European Union population. So about 700, and this is World Bank estimates, about 750 million people worldwide don't have regular access to electricity, right? So for them, the poverty and inequality of the energy problem, which is front and center a problem or a causal issue with climate change, right? Don't even have access to electricity on a regular basis. It's a very important thing to keep in mind when we think about what we need to do in the global north or in the west. Even if we look at a country like China, right? Everyone in China and India has access to electricity. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. The next slide that you see, I previously mentioned the vulnerable places. The one that's up now you may recognize as the United States. You probably haven't seen that breakdown by county, but you can look at in this case, it's the lighter areas, not the darker blue areas that are most vulnerable. That tends to be concentrated in poorer counties and counties in the sort of Midwest, and there may be some Ohio counties in there too. I was a little surprised when I saw this, that the coastal regions are, I guess because of their institutions and wealth, presumably more resilient. But, and this goes back to the point of the first slide. I heard that there was some, I got here a little late, technically not until today, but very late last night, so I wasn't here for the early plenaries. But I heard that there was some discussion about our needs to massively reduce our energy consumption as a planet. And while I think on a planetary basis that might be true, I think that's a pretty impractical thing to think about. What you can see now is most of us probably have the perspective of a North American or European in terms of our energy consumption. This graphic shows you North American energy consumption per person. Of course, this is an average, not a distribution across it. Next to that is the energy consumption of your typical European Union member, which is more than half, or less than half, I should say, of the typical American consumption. The next bar there is the consumption per capita in China, which, as most of you know, despite rapid economic growth over the last several decades, still is a relatively poor country, at least compared to the global north. And then the last bar that you can see there is the average consumption in the rest of the world for the remaining 6 billion or so, right? So when we think about what we need to do about energy and economic and ecological transformations, I think it's probably foolhardy to think that we're going to massively reduce our overall energy consumption, right? Our overall energy consumption is not the climate change problem. It is not the inequality problem, right? What we probably need to do, it seems to me, is we need to we'll probably increase our energy consumption over the next several decades. And in fact, we would need to do that to give people in most of the world, right, some notion of, or some level of energy consumption that approaches, say, the current Chinese energy consumption. Now, to make that happen, we need different sources of energy for that transformation. And of course, for us in this room, most of us in this room, including those of us who flew here on a couple of plane flights, right? A massive reduction in our, maybe not, at least, probably our energy consumption, certainly the ways in which we consume that energy or the sources that we use to consume that energy, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind about how we need to go about this. Yes, there's lots of opportunities to conserve more energy, but from a global perspective, right, the globe is probably going to need more energy over the next 50 years to keep us all reasonably materially well off. And I mean that at, again, think more in terms of typical Chinese standard today rather than typical American standard. I think there may be, yeah. So how are we going to do this? I don't have easy solutions or answers, but a lot of people point to some European countries like Germany or Denmark who happen to have a fair amount of renewable energy use and have conducted reasonably rapid energy transformations. The catch is they pay for it. We would need to roughly triple the typical electricity price in the United States per kilowatt hour, right, to reach the levels of prices that you see in countries like Germany or Denmark, countries that in Europe are on the forefront of transforming their formerly fossil fuel intensive energy systems into more sustainable, or at least less CO2 producing ones. If we look at the United States, which is the last slide that I have here, I think, you can see that spending more on energy, electricity prices, are in fact associated with having more renewable resources. Now, I'll add to this somewhat controversially that I've included nuclear power as a renewable source in this, and that's in part because the only way that you can get any states in the US to have a reasonable profile these days of renewable energy is to include nuclear power. So my home state of Connecticut looks really bad if you look at the percentage of solar and wind that we have in the state. The wind doesn't blow very hard in Connecticut. That happens out on Rhode Island and Block Island. But we have a great big nuclear plant that, and we import some hydro from Canada that help us to pretend that our 18 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity is worth it from a sustainability perspective. I think the price in Ohio is about 9 cents or something. So we're probably not priced high enough, and I think you guys in Ohio may need to hike the prices up a little bit before we can start talking about massive transformation. Anyway, so I don't know. Maybe that's a damper. I will conclude with this though. I mean, these are pricing issues. With these pricing issues, probably we can get into questions about, well, we have lots of inequality in the United States. We have lots of inequality around the world. How the heck are we going to afford these price signals? Certainly we would be pricing a lot of poor people, right, to death by raising electricity prices for many people. And I think we'll get into this in the Q&A, but this is a place where in order to do this and to get any political juice for something like this, we probably need to be redistributing income, or at least the proceeds of these high energy taxes in some way that helps make it socially affordable, not just necessary to achieve the energy transformations that we need to achieve to make the planet livable for the next century. Thanks.
Okay, so coming out to a broader view again, from a global perspective, JD, where do the issues of sort of environmental climate justice and economic inequalities lie for UNDP, and how are you all thinking about it right now?
Thanks, Shelley. First of all, as we discussed before, a huge caveat, which is I randomly opinionate about things because that's my job. I don't presume to speak for UNDP or the rest of the UN system. And also, second caveat is a lot of what I'm discussing here, full disclosure, it comes out of conversations people like Shelley and myself have had over a number of years. So don't stop me if you've heard this before. Hans-Ott, you started off by saying, you're from Denmark, which is a small country. Well, I'm from Malaysia, which is an even smaller country that very few people can pin on a map. Malaysia is now an upper middle income country, reasonably developed, but not advanced. And I'm old enough now that I basically grew up through a large arc of Malaysia's development story. From a country that was, when I was born, still relatively agricultural and quite highly rural, through an industrialization boom to reaching a middle income country status, and is now grappling with a lot of the issues in development that Lyle, you and Hans-Ott were talking about. Inequality, how do you develop a social system that's equitable? How do you develop systems and structures that ensure that the needs of all people are taken care of? And how do you do that in an increasingly complex and interrelated world where a lot of the outcomes you're trying to accomplish cannot be determined by people within Malaysia or a government within Malaysia by itself? So coming out of that lived experience, I ended up, long story, in UNDP working with colleagues like Shelley and others. And I look now as part of our organization at the question of how we as a development organization and how development as a practice and a sector can help the world move in the direction we all want to get to. And what is that direction? Well, September 2015 was one of the last points in recent history when every country in the world managed to agree on one thing. And that one thing was the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, within which we have the SDGs. And many of you have heard of these. So we agreed at that point that there was a broad vision of how we all as one global community felt we need to be able to develop, to create a world which was sustainable from an economic, a social, and an environmental perspective. So for the first time, recognizing that the totality of what development means, what human aspiration requires, combines all of these things, and to do so together in a universal agenda that left no one behind. That was what the world agreed to in 2015. And pretty much the day after we agreed on that, as a global community, we stopped agreeing on pretty much everything else. Well, that's a bigger question we'll get to as we talk about what's happening in the world and where we're going. So what we do in UNDP right now is we're the kind of the frontline agency that's tasked to help the communities of the world, particularly the developing world, think about how do you get to that agenda. And when we in UNDP, and again, sorry, Shelley, I'm going to double you on this one, I mean we and others in our teams, thought about how we work with the global community to help move this forward, there were a couple of insights there that I think are pertinent to this discussion. Firstly, we talk a lot in the context of the 2030 Agenda about the 17 SDGs and the various targets under them. And there's sometimes a tendency to look at those as 17 individual problems. Ending poverty, providing good food, health, decent livelihoods for people, reducing inequality, ensuring sustainability both on land and in the oceans, dealing with climate, creating a peaceful and just society. But the first thing that was apparent to those of us who've been working on these issues for a while is not only are these issues all connected to each other, but you can't actually accomplish the totality unless you focus on why and how these issues are interconnected. So Hans-Ott, when you were talking about the rights, the human rights, the justice, what we broadly put within the sphere of our work on governance and norms and rights, you talked about that, and Lyle, when you're talking about the challenges of climate and the economic transformations that are needed. These issues are all interconnected. The challenge we face and the struggle we've been working on is understanding how they're interconnected, and therefore how you manage to move that entire spaghetti web of issues in one direction at the same time. We don't have a clear answer to that yet. We're far away from it, but a big part of the work that we've been doing in UNDP over the last couple of years has been to think about not just what we need to work on, not just what are the connection points and the nodes in that complex system that we need to push in order to make everything move forward, but also thinking very deeply about the practice of how we do development. What is the role of an external actor in trying to influence a system, whether that system is a village community trying to develop a better set of livelihoods, or whether it's a nation state trying to develop in a certain way. What is the most effective role of an external actor to come in and influence change within that system? So a lot of our thinking right now has been questioning and challenging our assumptions about the how. And one of the points, I think, on which most of us at least agree, and UNDP as a family tends to be quite fractious and doesn't always agree on things, one of the things we do agree on is that the how needs to become a lot more connected. That one of our flaws as an institution and as a system is we have become way too focused on specific dimensions. That we have teams that do amazing work on human rights, but as Hans-Ott was saying earlier, even within our practice and our community, the people who are working on rights have often tend to look only at rights as an issue and not looked at how they're connected into a broader set of issues around effective governance or inequality or equity or inclusion or environmental sustainability. So we needed to get better at understanding those connections and building the lenses and perspectives that allow us to see those connections. And then we needed to figure out how to translate that perspective both into capacities and viewpoints that we can help other people grasp. So how do you get decision makers in governments, technical specialists within policy apparatus, other development actors, local communities, to understand those connections? And how do you then develop the the tools and approaches that allow people to be able to translate those into practice. It's well and good to be able to say, well, all the 17 goals and 169 targets are all connected to each other, so you can't really deal with one without dealing with the other. Well, fine, JD, then where do I start? What do I actually do? And so part of the practice we're going through, the journey we're going through right now is trying to think through how do we start understanding the world of development from that perspective? And how do we start working with communities of others to be able to develop the practice needed to understand how to take action and how to explain and convince others what actions need to be taken? So that's where we're at the moment. And I'll end with two sort of kickoff insights on where our thinking is at the moment. First of all, the bad news is that all the easy stuff has been done. Okay? So when you look at the question of development in the traditional sense, if you go back 50, 60 years, the whole idea of development was let's all fly into a developing country which is poor and backward, and with our wealth of expertise and resources, we can fix a lot of the problems. Well, yes, you could do a lot, because at that point in many of these places, the problems were a lack of things. It was a lack of resources, it was a lack of schools, it was a lack of trained public administrators, it was a lack of roads, it was a lack of decent work opportunities, and a lack of things you can fix in some respects. In most parts of the world today, with some exceptions, those problems have been fixed, and where they haven't been fixed, the people in those places have more than enough experience and expertise to draw from to fix those things themselves. The challenge we face right now, those of us who work on the issues of development and where this planet is going, are the intractable things that are, first of all, subtle and complex, and secondly, highly context-specific. So, Hans-Ott, you were talking just now about the measurement of poverty, and you're absolutely right. The interesting point and the point that really matters now is not poverty that's measured by how many dollars a day, but poverty from the multidimensional point of view of what is a person, a household, a community deprived of that limits their ability and their capacity to develop in the way they want. Solving that problem today is not just a question of giving them stuff, it's understanding the barriers, the inhibitions, the inequalities, the power dynamics that limit their ability to achieve the resources they need. So development is now a lot harder than it used to be. The second intuition we have is that most of what we need to be able to solve these problems already exist in the world today. The solutions are out there, they're just, to steal a quote, unevenly distributed. But the key insight we've learned the hard way is a lot of the solutions actually already exist in the spaces that we work in. Again, traditionally, our practice of development has been to go into a place, a community or a country, to look for a problem, and then look in the rest of the world to try and find the best in the world solutions to give to them. The reality today is that very often, pretty much every single time you go in and you look intensely and carefully with an open and inquiring mindset at a local context, not only do you see the problem, you see the seeds of the solutions already being developed by the people in that context because they know the problem way better than you do. And our role as development, our sense and our intuition right now is much more how do you find those, connect those, scale those up and support those, rather than pretend that you can come in from the outside and change an entire system by yourself. So I'll leave that as an opener because I think, Trish, you're going to be able to talk about how you actually do everything that I just talked about.
Well, we're going to be here for a while if that's my assignment. Thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be here, and especially to be living in the legacy of decades of human rights work, which become more and more important in the age of 45, in the age of Citizens United, where it's just not a given anymore that human rights goals and values are shared by everyone. So the work that all of you are doing is incredibly important. I grew up, I'm an immigrant from India, and I was a social worker, I was a community organizer, a policy advocate, and really kind of came into this work with a savior mentality, and was thankfully liberated from it by a lot of people that are very much smarter than me, many of whom I've encountered through the organization I work with, which is 1,000 Currents. If we can go to that first slide. Oops, sorry, different one. There we go, amazing. So this is a picture of the Buen Vivir gathering, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Thousand Currents is a foundation based in the United States. We support organizations, networks, and movements in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, focusing on food sovereignty, climate justice, and alternative economic development. The way we do that is that we do long-term general operating grants, which means we give kind of funding for whatever organizations need the funding for. They don't need to tell us what they need it for, and they don't need to account for exactly what they did with it, meaning our reporting is really an open invitation for these organizations to kind of report anything they want to on the progress they've made in the last year. So we really view our work as the work of partnerships. So distributing those funds is just the beginning of a relationship building process where we develop a relationship based in deep solidarity. And in that relationship, we as the grant maker are the students of the questions and the solutions that you just identified. And our teachers are varied and brilliant, but they're not perfect. And I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that, not to romanticize and exoticize the organizations we work with. They're people like us who are facing incredibly large barriers to both survival and thriving, and they are taking the legacy of their social movements forward. So somewhat imperfectly and with a lot of learning along the way. And so that's where we are now. We're really building relationships with a very broad range of partners, some very large, like La Via Campesina, which is a peasant farmers network of over 9 million indigenous people in the global south, fighting very hard against kind of industrial agriculture for the rights of farmers everywhere, all the way to AFSA, the African Food Sovereignty Association, which is doing a continent-wide organizing process to lift up the kind of knowledge, wisdom, technology, and political organizing efforts of farmers across the continent. And I wanted to highlight the work of a more regular organization. One of the partners I work with is the Women's Awareness Center of Nepal. They are a network of 45,000 subsistence farmers, mostly indigenous women, who make somewhere between $1 and $2 a day. And they are organized into 42 local cooperatives. In each of those cooperatives, they have individual savings accounts and they have cooperative savings. And so they have managed to pool about $4.5 million in collective assets. And each of those autonomous cooperatives really govern those assets separately, but also do an intricate system of micro-lending to each other for both local development and cooperative-wide development. And what they found was that they were getting a lot of pressure in the 90s to kind of become a bank, a micro-lending institution. And when they studied the banking systems, what they found is that banks always have a floor for what is the lowest acceptable income for someone taking a loan from the bank. And their members were below that floor, meaning they did not earn enough to qualify for bank-based loans. So they refused to become a bank. And instead, they set their own very low interest rates according to the consensus decision-making of the members. And then what they found is that a lot of women in these rural communities were leaving the banks to come into the cooperative because the lending rates were lower. And so the banks across Nepal started lowering their interest rates to be competitive with the cooperative. And in this way, these network of farmers really fundamentally changed some of the banking models in Nepal. What we also found was that after the earthquake in 2015, they met about 3 days after the earthquake, and within a matter of about 2 days, decided exactly how they wanted to distribute thousands of dollars in relief funding through a consensus decision-making model, again, across those 42 cooperatives. So that ability to have a high level of functional democracy is really based in the fact that they do that every day, every year over the course of 25 years. And it's the kind of model we really look to understand what are the solutions that you're referring to JD, that this is a model that represents democracy, self-determination, agricultural sustainability, and political power. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to just examine some of the core values that we deal with in the course of our work at Thousand Currents. But I can't read that slide. And I was wondering if you would read it for me.
Sure. On one side, you have the grain, and on the other side, you have Buena Vivere.
Buen vivir.
Buen Vivere.
So the grain refers to our kind of dominant ideology of development in the global north.
Individual choice, relationships are optional, transactional relationship, earth as a possession and a shopping basket, perpetual growth and expansion, white supremacy, and ethno-nationalism.
I want to just make a note of that ethno-nationalism, which is a very growing problem especially in the global south, as we all know. And, just since in the US we focus so much on both racism and racial justice, I kind of want to include that in our worldview of some of the barriers we're talking about. And when we talk about Buen Vivir, I'm referring to a very specific kind of political legacy coming out of Latin America and indigenous movements there.
Balancing the needs of individual and community, culture of interdependence, reverence for the ecosystem, and cosmovision, evolution according to need of many and always in balance, indigenous technology, and I do not have perfect eyesight either. So.
Thank you. We can go to the next one. So then I also wanted to look at some of the values underlying these different development sectors. So we have mainstream development, we have mainstream philanthropy, and then we have progressive philanthropy. If you could read those, I'm sorry.
Ooh, that's
You're going to have to get up for this one.
Mainstream development sector, global south communities are broken and should be fixed. People are disorganized. Earth should be harnessed for value it presents to economies. Trade policies are to be utilized, not changed.
Great.
Shall I go on?
Let's keep going to the mainstream philanthropy.
Mainstream philanthropy, global south communities are broken and should be fixed. The more money you have, the more you know. Grants are investments with a return. People need to get better at capitalism.
Thank you. And then let's go to progressive philanthropy.
Thousand Currents doesn't mince words, so here we go. Progressive philanthropy, and I hope we have some of our other philanthropists in the room. We do not. They had a fantastic conversation about this. Communities know how best to improve their own lives, are experts and teachers. Movements are necessary for human progress, redistribution and reparations. Donors can be organized and transformed.
Right. So that goes to kind of one of our core beliefs at Thousand Currents, that not only are we doing our best work when we're redistributing resources, which give movements and organizations the freedom to do the work and innovation that they want to do, but also that it is our duty to really change philanthropy in the global north and really shift some of those values. And what we found is that it's totally possible. We have an academy which happens twice a year, in which we invite philanthropists to come join us and talk about our collective work of repair, renewal, and innovation, right? And so we do not have the answers to your questions. We are not the experts. All the good ideas I shared with you today are the ones that were taught to me by indigenous leaders from across the world. But what we do have is the political will to make structural change possible. And so I'll just stop there.
Great, thanks. So I want to get us into more of a conversation. Anybody who's been watching these plenaries knows we put one disruptor in every plenary. I guess you just found out who she is, and she was not, her disruption happened all at the beginning. So in any event, we need to sort of take the conversation to a little more of an interaction and then open it up for questions from you all. And I wanted to shift something we had discussed earlier, something that is important coming back to the United States, is a lot of the conversation that we have here around ideas about the Green New Deal coming out of young millennial Democrats and sort of framed in a very progressive light for the political discourse in the United States. And so I wanted, Lyle, you to talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States in terms of the perception of climate change, the perception of economic inequality, and what kind of research findings you have about where the public stands on some of these ideas to shift some of these transformations domestically.
Okay. So I do some work on public opinion, and I have done some on climate change. I haven't researched the Green New Deal directly, but some research that we've done on climate change, as you probably know, it's a very divided issue in partisan terms in the United States, or at least it appears to be. A lot of people are more optimistic a lot of our research, or some of our research, has shown that a lot of the division is driven from the top. That is to say, most of us don't know tons about the science or the situation of climate change. We're leading our lives. We tend to take our cues from leaders, either community, political, et cetera. And that, within, at least in the US polarized camp, those who tend to be on the political right, who tend to be more skeptical of climate change, we find that at least among ordinary citizens in that camp, they seem to be following what leaders say. So if we sort of manipulate in surveys the communicator of a pro-climate message, we find that people who are otherwise on the right are much more receptive to climate change arguments. Now, that's the positive side. I think more skeptically on the negative side, if you look a little deeper, and this goes to the Green New Deal, et cetera, and some of the comments I made earlier, if you ask people how much they're willing to sacrifice, to pay, right, to transform the energy system, right? Are you willing to pay $10 more a month for electricity, $100 more a month for electricity? One is much more hard-pressed to find a lot of support, not only among those who tend to fall into the camp who express climate skepticism, let's say, but also well into the middle or to the, let's say, left of that distribution. Just to sort of take I was going to do it as a poll, but many of you, and I know that a lot of my students have to drive a lot. I know a lot of you in the room, or at least I'm gauging a lot of you in the room are students. If I told you that and most of them are on a budget, if I told you that the price of gas was going to be $1 or $1.50 more a gallon, how receptive would you be to voting for such a policy to help change the climate? And you quickly find that a lot of people who are otherwise optimistic about the changing climate aren't willing to do that. Well, $1.50 extra for gas is the average extra tax that Europeans pay for gasoline. And Europe, a country that uses less gasoline than we do, but certainly not a country that only runs on electric vehicles or only runs on mass transit, right? Probably or may well be pricing gas too low for trying to get us to a carbon zero or net carbon zero economy. Public support, this is not polling that I've done, but some progressive pollsters in the US have looked at a lot of progressive issues. And among two that don't poll well in the general public and in the Democratic public are two things that I'm going to guess are somewhat popular in this room. The Green New Deal does not poll very well when it's described as requiring increased taxation, and universal basic income does not poll well. That is to say, again, even among the center left, these are often polls that are done to try to gauge at this stage what Democratic presidential candidates should be wanting to do. So as important as I personally think, and maybe many of you think, these issues are for transforming the country, it's important to recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to convince people that those ideas, even in the sort of center left of America, are good ideas, are good policy to run on, or worth voting for.
And as as I said earlier, when I looked at the Green New Deal coming out of UNDP, I, of course, it's framed as very progressive, very left in the United States. I, of course, thought about all the development discourse that has gone on for years that actually, is, if you think of global agreements and how political it is amongst all member states to agree on agendas, you can't, or most of you wouldn't frame it as highly progressive and left. But in any event, the global agendas align quite a lot with some of the ideas in the Green New Deal. And JD, I wonder if you have thoughts on that and how it translates globally.
I do, and let me start with that, circle back, and then maybe come back to the point you made. I've lived in the States for 2.5 years now. I still kind of think of myself as being, and I'm only here to work, so I'm not even an immigrant. I'm just a temporary guest worker. And I still sometimes look at these discourses within the US from a little bit of that perspective. And I'll confess, and you know this because I said it just a little while ago, the Green New Deal being painted as something that's unaffordable and utopian and loony left kind of feels a bit weird, because if you look at how development has happened in many other parts of the world, frankly, the Green New Deal is China 2005, where a country decided at a very systematic and strategic level to think about changing in energy mixes, dealing with large-scale pollution issues, relocation of major industries, a redirection of an economic structure to move in a particular direction. It's not, for most of the rest of the world, it's not really something that is considered unusual in a policy space. And I'll give you a little anecdote before I move back into the bigger question. As I said, I grew up in Malaysia, and just south of us is Singapore. It's an island state. Right at the very south of Singapore, basically where the downtown area is, there is the mouth of the Singapore River, which was a bay. It's called Marina Bay. Okay? And Marina Bay, 20, 30 years ago, was basically a muddy estuary of a semi-polluted river. The Singapore government decided, and I'm guessing now, if I go back and check my facts, it's probably something like 25 years ago, actually more, about 30 years ago. First of all, they're going to clean up the river, which they did. They then realized that as a rapidly growing island state, one of their biggest strategic risks was fresh water. The island didn't produce enough fresh water, and they were dependent on buying water from Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, neighboring states. So they had this river flowing to the middle of Singapore that flowed out into the ocean. So you know what they did? They basically started a program, something like 25 years ago, to put barrages at the mouth of the Singapore River across the entire bay. And then they waited 20 plus years for the fresh water that was coming down the river they had cleaned to gradually clean out the silt and the salinity from that bay to turn it into a massive freshwater lake. Okay? So this was a decision, an investment that was on a multi-decadal timescale. Shock horror. For many parts of the world, this is how decisions are made by societies and where to invest. Okay? If you go back to the way in which water management was done in Denmark, the development of the levee system and others, there was a point in time where societies very regularly decided, yeah, we're going to do something that is now going to take us beyond our generation. Those of you, again, who like art and architecture will know about the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Starting off a project that people knew would not be completed for generations afterwards. And this used to be quite a normal way for societies to decide outcomes. Now, why is that all of a sudden now such a shocking thing? And I'll go back at some point, Lyle, into the conversation about the fracturing of societies into left and right, us versus them, red versus blue, because that's a slightly different topic. But let me circle back, long story, sorry, to what you were saying just now about the experience in Nepal, where cooperative decided they weren't going to go into the banking system because interest rates were too high, so they set their own interest rates that were lower. And so here's a basic question. Who decided what the interest rate should be and why? Okay? The interest rate is simply a question of how much money do I get back if I let you use my money for a particular period of time. the notion that there is such a thing as a interest rate is actually a completely artificial construct, and it is an artificial construct premised on some very foundational assumptions in economics that are so foundational most of us aren't even aware of them anymore. Number one, all of economics is based on the notion that individuals maximize individual utility. Meaning, economics is based on the premise that every decision I make is selfishly made on the basis of what's best for me. First insight, complete rubbish. No human being in the world works that way. But the layers above the substrata of our entire economic system are built on those assumptions. And so guys, if you start thinking about what needs to change in the world, do some archaeology and dig down into the foundational premises that are built, on which a lot of our policy discussions, our decisions about how resources are made, etc., those premises are there. The second point is the assumption built into a lot of our societal systems, our culture, our economics, our policy, that all our relationships with other people are transactional. Transactional meaning the only thing that matters is what I give and what I get. Again, complete rubbish. This is not how human beings function. So when you come back to the systems point of view, one of the shifts that we need to make is to try and figure out how you build economic, social, political structures that actually recognize how human beings work. And a lot of that goes back to the lessons you were learning through 1,000 Currents from people on the ground, which is the stuff that actually works when you are completely poor and disconnected from the global society and you're not worried about whether you can afford the next iPhone, but you're worried about whether you can put food on the table for your kids. Those systems are built on trust, on building the kind of functional democratic systems that allow you to very quickly mediate everybody's needs and come to a consensus. It's those systems that work. And so coming back to the point, Trishala, you were making about learning from the ground, one of the challenges we have in the world is to start building genuine global systems that recognize that's actually how people are happiest. Is when you build systems that allow us all to express what we all feel internally, which is we're a tribe, we're a connected community. I don't want to be in a situation where the economic and social and political structures I live in force me to deal with you as a stranger, because that's not how intuitively most people are actually engineered. Okay, so come back to the point, Lyle, you're making about the climate debate, or the fact that it's a divisive issue. And I'll just plant a provocation here we'll come back to later. Climate change is not a problem. Environmental destruction is not a problem. And we have a chance later, I'll tell you why. I will, though, come to the point you made about when you ask people, are they willing to pay $10 a month more for electricity or $1 a month more for a gallon of gas? The answer is going to be no. You're right, but that's the wrong question. The question is, do you want an economic and social system in which you get to pay $1.99 for gas, but you're paying $12,000 a year for healthcare? Or do you want an economic and social system where you're probably paying $3 a gallon for gas, but you have healthcare, education, and a social safety net that makes sure when you get sick, you're taken care of, you're educated, your kids are educated, and if things go wrong, you get taken care of? We got to be able to sell visions of systems that make sense to people, and not nickel and dime it down into, are you willing to make this trade-off on that trade-off? And again, I'm sorry, I'm not from here, I shouldn't comment on this, but so much of my concern about political discourse in many of the democracies in the world is we've traded it down to the transactional of, are you willing to make this tweak or that tweak, rather than saying, can I sell a vision of the world that in its complexity actually appeals to people, and then tell them getting from here to there is not going to be easy, it's going to take work, but when we get there, we're all going to be better off. And now I'm sorry, I will shut up.
No, that's why I work for UNDP, because they have all the answers. So why isn't this happening is the obvious question, right? We often talk about political will as being a sort of simplistic way of defining a whole series of very complex challenges and obstacles we face. I wonder, Hans-Ott, before we open it up for you all, and I thank you for your time to ask some questions, I wonder if you have any insights from your perspective of rights and economic systems, rights, and you were saying you're looking at rights and growth.
Yes.
What is that telling you?
So we are looking at the freedom rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, the the freedom to elect your officials, your authorities. And we are looking at these rights, and then we are examining how they might potentially have an impact on economic growth. And what we find is that over a range of years, 10 to 15 years, we do have a positive and significant impact on economic growth on average. So in a sense, the civil and political rights, which are not necessarily as associated with economic, social, with economic change, they do have an impact on economic change, I think. And we're not so much concerned about growth as such, but rather about economic change. And the second point I would like to argue is that when we are discussing system change and how the systems can change, and whether it's the good old capitalist system we should change, I'm also thinking of the way in which I think Acemoglu and Robertson analyzed why nations fail. And what they argued was that it's not so much, well, whether it's a capitalist system or not a capitalist system, but it's rather the kind of institutions embedded into the system. So if I compare the capitalist system in the US with the capitalist system in Denmark, there are some level of differences which I think fall to the Danish positive side, I would say. And that's because we have different sets of institutions. At least I think that's an important element. And when societies are able to influence the way in which institutions are operating, it also has to do with the fact that people have freedoms. They are able to keep a check on their governments. They are able to keep a check on their municipalities. They're able to speak up. They're able to fight. So I think these, on the one hand, we should have this from the ground perspective that you were talking about, and the ability of people to make choices. On the other hand, we should also have an understanding of that the system is only operating if we can keep it accountable to the people. And that's where the checks and balances come in as a simple way of expressing it.
Okay, there was a lot that I wanted to get out here, particularly on the innovation and technology side and making those linkages, but I also want to open up the conversation. So if there are questions, let's start them now, and then we can circle back on some of the questions around technology and innovation and what it has to say about these issues. Do we have any questions?
Yes, I do. I have a question and a comment, if I may. First of all, thank you so much for this panel and for the conference. It's been incredibly enriching. My name is Phyllis Tawa, and I'm a professor at the University of Arizona. I teach in the Human Rights Practice program there. I teach a course on human rights across contexts, and I look at citizen-led protest movements across Sub-Saharan Africa, and part of the curriculum is to include guest lectures with leaders. So I've been in conversations with leaders in Burkina Faso, Senegal, South Africa, Cameroon, and so on. So what I'm going to share with you as a comment and then pose to you as a question comes from conversations with these people, and I want to acknowledge that. So if we look at protest movements that are citizen-led and grassroots in Senegal, Burkina Faso, and the DRC, one of the things that I notice is that deprivations of freedom regarding electricity, water, phone, and internet are the triggers for collective protest. In Senegal, it was electricity. In Burkina Faso, it was a proposed revision of the constitution and trying to get rid of dictatorship when they were ranked 183 in the Human Development Index, so you all understand what that means. And in the DRC, it's access to clean drinking water, affordable cell phones, and internet connections, right? So these are the deprivations that trigger collective action. I just want to offer as one framework for the human rights perspective in terms of shaping change, and that is in Burkina Faso, where we have a movement called Ballet Citoyen, or Citizen Broom. It was started by a hip-hop artist, Smokey Bambara, and a reggae artist, Sams Kaloja. And the movement was successful in getting out a dictator who had been in power for decades. They are celebrating this year 15-year anniversary of a human rights film festival. The way the film festival works is choosing a theme. This year it's Why Is It Democracy? They have a series of films that speak to the question of democracy, and then they facilitate debates. And so this has been going on for quite a long time. The purpose of Ciné Droit Libre, this film festival, and also the Ballet Citoyen movement more generally, is to cultivate a demanding citizenry to hold their leaders accountable. So my question for you, in the spirit of intersectionality, is what role does culture play in your research, in your discussions? And when I'm talking about culture, I'm not necessarily speaking about theater or music, but culture. And then in terms of how culture informs your research, not necessarily peer-reviewed materials, but fieldwork and conversations. So I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on the role culture plays in change. Thank you.
And should we take a few questions and then respond to them? Any other questions? We can bring you. Okay. Well, Jackie, maybe first.
Okay.
You got there first.
My name's Jackie Smith. I'm a sociologist at the University of Pittsburgh and an organizer with the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance and the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance. And my question brings together both those identities. So I spend a lot of my time organizing these days and trying to engage people in thinking about what a human rights city would look like. So really thinking of this question of transformation and how can a human rights framework help us do that. And it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in my life. And it doesn't get funding or much in the way of volunteer research or volunteer commitment of energies. And it's really frustrating many days when we start a project and people start off really excited, and then if you've done organizing, you probably know that it's usually the same people that end up, coming through and putting the chairs away at the end of an event after they did the setup and everything else. So as a sociologist, I step back and try to figure out why is it that this is so hard when we have a lot of events, we get people really excited about this alternative idea about how we could organize our city, and they get excited when they meet people from different spaces that they don't intersect with, but then to get them to do something to try to make that happen is really hard. And I think two observations that I've made that JD's comments, I think, speak to, and I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. But I think our political system and even discourse around the Green New Deal really limits our political imagination. And a lot of our thinking about human rights or about even rights or civil rights, however people conceptualize it, really constrain our imaginations about what's possible. So how do we create spaces where people can get out of the box that, or I like to think of train tracks. The system sets up these tracks and people feed into these political parties and elections, and it means that they're thinking about one thing and they're not visioning a different place to go. So how do we open political imagination? But then how do we overcome what I think is one of our biggest obstacles, which is the culture of individualism and consumerism that prevents people from really jumping in and saying, yes, I'm going to put my career on the back burner and put my children and my grandchildren's future on the front burner in my work. So how do we build that sense of a collective responsibility and ownership of a project to make a better world? Thanks.
Okay, we have a few more and then we'll bring it back. So come on up. Paul.
Thank you. Paul Mara, I'm here at the Human Rights Center, and first, thank you for taking part in the third of 3 great plenaries. I think this question speaks to all 4 of you, but I guess I'll frame it in terms of JD's account first, and maybe some tension with Trishala's perspective, right? And I'm using first names. I work on social norms, like I don't know you, but I'm using your first names, right? So there's a question about the role of mega projects, specifically in solving some of the problems that I think Lyle and Hans also introduced for us having to do with climate change. And JD, you were particularly talking about some specific examples of the case in Singapore. We have local mega project examples here. So we have the Conservancy District for the Miami River, which was a response to, I don't know if it's counted as a 500-year or a 1,000-year flood. We have the interstate highway system here. Both of these were projects that required work bigger than the local context and required a lot of costs for a lot of local people, and were not negotiated in particularly democratic fashion, right? So that's one of the questions, right? You talked about laying out a vision that is ambitious enough to respond to the problems. We have the kinds of problems that Lyle talked about, right? The kinds of problems that Hans-Ott, I think you mentioned the German decision to move very much towards sustainable energy on their electrical grid, right? So I take it that's another kind of mega project. And Trishala, you were talking about empowering local populations. It's not clear to me that if mega projects are what has to be done in a lot of cases, how far local populations can take those on themselves, and what is the trade-off between just the massive infrastructure development sort of practices that have to be done with local ownership. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Yes, I'd like to focus on our energy guru, thank you for coming, on issues of net energy and economic growth. And the concept of net energy, with the oil age, the last 150, 160 years, used to be, you could go to the beginning of the 20th century and be down in Texas, you'd put a straw on the ground, and all this black gold would shoot up all over. But it's increasingly taking more energy to get energy. We took care of the low-hanging fruit. And we're going out into the Gulf of Mexico. We're heading up toward the Arctic Circle. We're going to tar sands in Alberta, in Venezuela too, but this oil there is like almost like rock, it's tar, and it takes energy and water, natural gas to melt it, to make it useful. So what's been happening, according to some energy analysts, is that net energy has been continuing to decline even with increasing energy use. And you have debates or arguments. It's now, the ratio used to be 101, it's now 10 to 1 and dropping. And at what point can you no longer maintain industrial civilization? So that's my question to you. Unless we come up with fusion energy or some exotic energy form, how are we going to do it? There are others that argue renewable energy, nowhere near can it be scaled up. We need a fossil fuel base 24/7. So that's the first issue. How are you going to get the increasing energy use you say we must have throughout this century for human rights? And the second point, and I'll be done, or I don't get it. Do I get it? Thank you.
Just quickly, please.
You made a point, our first panelist, about human rights and economic growth suspect. This whole issue, the whole sustainability initiative is saying, how can we have sustainability when we have this increasing economic growth? Because to have increasing economic growth means using a lot more energy. I mean, the correlation is perfect. The other problem is we have a debt-based money system. And in order to pay the interest on our debts, we have to have energy growth. So unless we change the way money works, instead of the Federal Reserve System with this bond system, debt system, instead of commercial banks creating money out of thin air as debt to themselves, requiring us to pay the interest, unless we just have the government issue credit directly without driving the nation deeper into debt, we're not going to solve our energy problems, our money problems, and our human rights problems. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I know there are others that had questions, but we'll take some of these so that we get a breather a bit. Obviously, I don't expect this panel to be able to answer every single thing that is posed, but I'll let you guys pick and choose what you feel like you can tackle Do you need me to go over them quickly? The role of culture, political imagination, individualism and consumerism, mega projects and mega development versus household and community-led development, and energy and economic growth. Over to you.
I can go ahead and start.
Please.
Sure. Well, those are really fun questions. Thank you. It made me think of a few things. So in terms of the human rights city dilemma, I just first want to applaud you for undertaking that process. And I'm sorry, I can't see the person. Oh, there you are. Thank you. It made me think of an experiment we did, which was we wanted to do kind of an intervention and an experiment in the social impact space. So this is like basically social impact investing is a tool that's being used a lot in the philanthropic sector to look at another way of thinking about grants or distributing money. It's about donors kind of putting money towards the idea that you can invest in the social good, and the returns are not always monetary, but are useful and impactful for everyone. So our experiment was what we called the Buen Vivir Fund, and we got 10 investors together to make a pool of about $1 million. And then we got about 15 indigenous organizations together, and they formed a collective fund that was governed by all of them. So how did we do that? So take an example of the indigenous group. I'm thinking of one called Cielo, based in Mexico, a network of about 33 indigenous communities, which basically run a cooperative recycling plant. And they had an opportunity to double the size of what they were manufacturing in terms of recycled plastic products, and they chose not to because it violated their own internal agreements of what is to work and live in balance. So their agreements are that their workers only work 30 hours a week, that they only use a certain percentage of the water that the community has access to, and that they distribute all their profits evenly, and they determine that based on the needs of the community. And so what they found was this contract kind of took them outside of their community agreements, and so they didn't do the expansion project. And this is one of the kinds of groups that's part of the Buen Vivir Fund, right? So it's all about this question of what is real sustainable growth? What does it look like to have growth that meets people's needs but is not excessive and doesn't create profit margin, which also hurts the earth? So these are the kinds of groups we had together. We met in Mexico for a week, and what we did was we started out by exchanging money stories. So we're talking about 10 very wealthy, high net worth donors and about 25 indigenous organizers talking together about what was the value of money in our lives. How do we understand money? Where do we have shame around money? And how have we transformed our relationship to money over time to be in alignment with our values? And that created this very interesting kind of emotional connection. Over the course of the next year, they formed the terms of the Buen Vivir Fund. So they decided that each organization that's applying to get money from this fund is going to submit an application that the entire group gives feedback on, gets a grant to get ready for that application process, and then uses those loans funds at a 0% interest rate. But the payback includes what they call an apport payment, meaning it's a payment which is in goods and values, not necessarily money, right? And so those were the collective terms, and this fund is now 2.5 years running, and they're actually meeting right now in Guatemala. And it's really about the process of both collective decision-making, getting to know each other, breaking the silos of how we relate to each other, and looking at what does collective use of resources look like when you do it over the long term with relationships. In terms of the role of culture, what I was reminded of was actually a brilliant man I just met named Dayton, who's no relationship to me, was a farmer in Orisha, and he basically is single-handedly preserving 114,000 varieties of rice from all over the subcontinent. And he's doing it on less than 4 acres of land, which you can just imagine the incredible math and determination that goes into that. And he talked about his idea of technology. And he said in 12,000 years of human agriculture, there has been multiple famines, and yet humanity has grown in size, right? Which is basically kind of a testament to the ability for human beings to use agriculture. And he talked about the role of technology. He said that the software is the knowledge of agroecology, of organic and indigenous modes of agriculture, right? Of how to create agricultural systems that do not deplete the earth, but work in balance with the earth. The hardware are the seeds, and the culture is the superstructure that holds it all together. Culture is the thing that makes it so that the people who eat biryani and who eat 64 varieties of rice-based desserts are the ones that's what's determining what seeds continue to be used. Culture is the driving force of every decision we make in terms of production. So that's one way that I think about culture, right? It's the thing that motivates us to do one thing and not the other. And the role of cultural production and interruption is the role of political imagination, right? It's the one that helps us be amazed by what we can produce together versus what we can produce in division.
Somebody want to take on some of the other questions that were posed, and we'll take a few more. JD,
Yeah.
do you want to start, and then?
Okay. Yeah. We can go backwards. Which also leaves me the luxury of not having to answer all of them.
Yes,
That will be up to
please.
the last person.
Yeah.
Yes. So just touching very briefly on a couple of things. Paul, the question about the role of mega projects. 2 intuitions. One, at the point where in the US it was possible to design and agree on something like the interstate highway system, was a point in time where the degree of societal trust in the institutions of governance was high enough that the systems of governance could do that without having to go back and get validation. I don't think that's the case today. I think one of the reasons why in the US now we struggle to come up with the kind of big interventions needed to be able to deal with the scale of challenges we face today is intuitively most politicians and policy leaders realize that citizens overall lack the degree of trust needed in institutions for institutions to make those kind of decisions in closed spaces. And you cannot design an interstate highway system through collective consensus. However, even if you're in a situation where almost sort of statist top-down mega projects are not possible, and the question of how you rebuild trust and trust in institutions, a subset of societal trust, is a different one we can get back to. Even if that's not the case, it's not necessarily the case that you can't do anything large. One of the interesting conversations we've had internally in terms of how you motivate large-scale change has been around trying to create a narrative in societies around moonshots and missions. The difference between a moonshot and a project is with a moonshot, you set an aspiration that's compelling enough that the entire system, the entire society, mobilizes to start filling in the pieces of how you get there. If you go back and you look, for instance, at what happened with the actual original moonshot, there's a metric some of our colleagues, ex-NASA people, said there was a point in time where it was something like 3% of the entire GDP of the United States was devoted towards getting a man to the moon. Not because there was a master plan that said here's how it's going to be done, but because there was a vision set out that people bought into, and everybody then within the system mobilized to respond to that. So maybe one of the questions is it possible in the current societal structures here to create that sense of vision and mass movement that then pushes individuals within communities, corporations, societies, states, cities to all move in a particular direction? And maybe that's what's happening in a nascent way with things like the climate action and others. Maybe, I don't know. Jackie, on the question of you talked a lot about the human rights city and the question of how do you mobilize people to work on rights. And again, caveat, I'm the least expert person in this room on the question of human rights and how you work on human rights. Okay, I will say that honestly. But I will say this as a slight provocation. Perhaps one of the problems with the notion of rights, my individual rights, is that it does reinforce the transactional and individualist nature of the systems you work within. The whole notion, and I can see you shaking your heads, and I say this as a provocation because I think we need to unpack that a little bit. A lot of what is perceived as the discourse around rights is my controlling for myself, my community, my tribe, my nation, my segment of society, what power we have. And I think there's a risk sometimes that gets then interpreted as a zero-sum game of, for me to assert my right means I'm taking away power from someone else. And perhaps what we need to think about is, how do you frame this? And I know the answer is not that. How do you frame this discussion of rights in a way that says, creating a society that shares power equitably is a space where you create a much larger set of possible outcomes for the society overall. The equitable sharing of power actually increases the potential of a society to be able to deal with the big problems. Don't ask me how you get there, but my hunch is there's probably a space there where we can make an argument that actually a more equitable, and Hans-Ott, this maybe goes back to the difference you're talking about between, we're oversimplifying here, Denmark and the US. It's not only trust in institutions, it's trust amongst the individuals in society, reflected in how much power they're willing to give to institutions. So that's maybe a provocation that could be a good place to hand over to you.
On the issue of culture, I talked about the importance of institutions. For me, institutions are the culture, because institutions are the norms at play. They are the systems of interaction. They're the rules of the game. And when we are working with human rights, we are often trying to affect the culture, not necessarily in changing people's attitudes, but in changing behavior. And we are trying, I think my institute has had some success in working with the police in Niger in West Africa, and trying to work with the police as partners. And through that work, we have managed to increase the trust in the police, measured by some external agencies. So in a way, I think the institutional mechanisms are very important, but not necessarily in trying to change the way people think, but in trying to change how they behave in particular contexts. On the issue of economic growth and sustainability, I don't see that as necessarily two entirely opposite dimensions. It depends on how you control economic growth. And that's we don't have any perfect systems for doing that. I acknowledge that. But for instance, if I've been interviewing maybe about 200 or 300 African farmers in various places on the continent, and whenever I meet them, they are talking about the need for growing incomes. That's their first priority. And so in a way, should I say, no, but we better keep a restrictive system of environmental sustainability, so you don't need this economic growth? No, I don't think that would work.
Maybe to you, Lyle, then, on energy and whose growth are we talking about?
Well, I've had a chance to, and so I think one thing to think about in terms of growth is I think you put your finger on it in reposing the question. Well, first of all, economic growth need not be growth in throughput, in energy consumption, right? You can have economic growth without necessarily having more buildings, right? It's a notion of value added, and many people have talked about things in here that are places where we could add value without increasing anything physical. I think I think that's one issue. I think a lot of transformations or even some redistributions of resources might increase total value added, right, in some abstract sense, by empowering people to make particular decisions, right? I mean, for an economist, talking about utility, and not individual utility maximization, but utility is in many ways subjective. It doesn't, increasing everyone's utility in the room doesn't mean that we have to have increased the size of the building, right? But I think that we carry this notion of growth, that it demands more resource consumption, because traditionally, I think that it has, and for many people and many industries, right, it does entail increasing or expanding consumption. On the question of culture, I kind of agree a little bit with you that culture, I think of culture as institutions and maybe something like shared understandings. And one thing I think that comes into the role of culture and shared understandings is lots of times, especially people who are being agents of transformation, we're actually trying to change people's understandings, right? And in that sense, we're trying to change culture. And that, in some ways, it's a double-edged sword, right? We often think, well, culture is important and we want to change it, but you have to recognize that sometimes those changes are asking some people, right, maybe to do things differently that make them uncomfortable, right? And of course, we often, hopefully, we're only pursuing those changes that are in people's best interests or will make them happier in the end. With respect to to the energy and growth thing, we don't need a petroleum underpinning we don't need a fusion underpinning to run the economy. There's enough distributed power. There's some technical solutions to dealing. There's enough wind. Just to give an example, which I'd never really thought of until someone mentioned it. The sun doesn't shine at night, but if you use the sun to pump water uphill during the day, you can run a dam. You can run a hydroelectric dam at night. I mean, that's a very simple, tangible way in which, right, you can get around some of these things. I mean, some would seem like technical barriers. Human Rights City. Yeah.
You have one. Can I ask for a few more questions,
Yeah,
and then
sure,
we can come
sure.
back
Sure.
one more time, because I know this is tiring, but for me it's really exciting, and I know two amazing people back there, particularly Allison has a question, and she's an economic, social, and cultural rights colleague, and we have another colleague back there who'd like to ask a question. So Allison, over to you.
Thank you. This is a comment for reflection, actually, but I think that's been permitted from the moderator. I want to pick up on the theme of siloing, and I think that really resonated, your analysis of the SDGs being seen as 17 different areas of work. I think even within economic and social rights, which is one part of human rights, we have different people working on health and education and housing and water, and that's a real limitation. But I want to maybe push back a bit on the idea that the issue is we don't know what the connections between them are. Because I think the connections between them are what has been discussed in the panel today. It's a fundamental questioning of some of these foundational assumptions about the economy, and namely that growth measured as GDP is the main indicator of progress. And I think the $1.90 a day poverty line has been problematic and complicit in reinforcing this message that economic growth is the goal. And the design of the global economic system that has been built up around this idea is one that really deprives a lot of developing countries of the policy space to enact the kind of green industrial policy that you kind of suggested would help to address climate change. I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but we know about trillions of dollars of illicit financial flows, the fact that developing countries control a lot smaller percentage of GDP than developed countries, that the private sector is promoted kind of aggressively as filling that gap. And I think kind of seeing this as part of what contributes to climate vulnerability more explicitly is really important. The example of Mozambique this year, 2 back-to-back cyclones have left 1 million people at risk of hunger, but it's not the cyclone, it's the gutting of the Mozambique economy through resource exploitation and through structural adjustment policies. And so connecting economic vulnerability and climate vulnerability, I think, is really important. And I think what makes climate change an exciting issue from the perspective of human rights activists is that it does unite a lot of diverse causes. You do see the connections between the various pockets of work that we're doing. There's a lot of calls that have come out in the context of thinking about climate change through the lens of human rights, of we need to look at root causes and we need to connect the dots. And I think the conversation that's important to have as human rights activists is what are the tools and the concepts that we need in order to be able to do that effectively. And I think from my perspective, some of those include building up a lot more economic literacy amongst human rights activists so that we can be participating in some of these deliberations and really starting to tackle this issue of political will, which, as you say, is a euphemism. It's actually that there are powerful vested interests in maintaining the status quo, and we need to challenge that. So, yeah, as I said, reflections on that would be really welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. And we haven't even gotten to those powerful corporate interests, and I see Joanne and others whose lives are around these corporate questions. Over to you.
So I'm noticing a discourse here around sort of the knowledge for development piece of the UN. It's a long-term project. And it comes out a little bit in Lyle's discussion of qualitative growth versus just quantitative growth is one way to think about economic growth. Yeah. But certainly JD's discussion of the practice of how and how we should emphasize this. What's the role of an external actor to come in and influence change within a system, you asked. At the same time, it seems this knowledge for development piece that the UN has been celebrating big data and research on these questions. It has, I think, pushed some of the insights, what I would call economic sociological insights that you were referring to earlier, JD. We can't just assume that we're all profit maximizers as market participants and build assumptions from there. But the questions that big data allows us to ask and the predictive analytics that come with it, don't let us answer the questions of why, which I think are just as important as the questions of how. They can tell us, or try to predict, what we will do next and cash in on that. They can commodify this, even in various development schemes. But I'm wondering to what extent research at the UN is still committed to these important why questions and how you see those coming together as we try to address the practice of how.
Can we take one more question? Is there anybody else? I would love somebody to ask something corporate responsibility-wise. No, besides you, sorry. Anybody else? One more over here. And you're going to get us there, and colleague over there, and then we'll go back to the panel. And I know you guys are so tired, but this, you indulged me. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so I'm Sinead McGrath from University College Dublin. Just focusing specifically on the economies that are the root of the climate crisis, which are high-income economies. How do you feel about the debate around degrowth and circular economies, etc.? And I saw that you do a lot of work with food sovereignty. And have you encountered networks based in the global north, in inverted commas, just to use imperfect language, that work also around those movements?
Great question. Thank you. Colleague.
Thank you. My name is Leo. I'm a PhD candidate at Boston College, and I come from Congo. So I would like to ask a question on research and the role of religion in affecting human rights. And I want to give the example in the Congo, actually, in the sense of political imagination or social imagination that we need to start effectively impacting change. In the Congo, actually, those who are killed are inspired by religion systematically. Those who are killed in working for human rights, they really do believe that, this life is not the whole story. that it's worthy to give my one life so that the whole community can get something. So religion does have power. And actually human rights organization at the international level, they do work with faith-based organization. So in your research as United Nations or just human rights, do you care about that aspect as important at the local level? Thank you.
Thank you. Is that it? We've maxed out this whole space in terms of questions. You're all dying to get out of here, ideally. Nobody else has a question. We sure? Oh my gosh. We didn't even get into technology and innovation. But over to you all for final thoughts before we...
On the religion, on the role of religion, we have, in my institute, we have 2 researchers who are working on freedom of religion. And that's also because we are recognizing the importance of religion as a mobilizing force, as you are talking about. I completely agree. It is important, especially, maybe not in secular Denmark, but in other contexts.
Nothing applies to Denmark, by the way, here, but we could debunk that.
It's
We
only a
just
small
don't have the
country.
time. Thoughts, colleagues?
Should I go first?
Well, I think, so I'll try to tackle the degrowth question. I mean, this is a little flip, but in the United States, you could argue that a large majority of the population has essentially experienced degrowth over the last 30 years. If you look at basically falling wages for, high school age white males, or I think even non-white males. Now that's not systemic degrowth, but I think probably what you have in mind is something about some sort of consolidation of the amount of throughput that we generate in the economy, and I think that's a debate that I'm not that familiar with the degrowth literature per se. I think the notion of potentially shrinking our overall footprint, it really starts to pertain to with respect to what? So with respect to energy, one problem is we sort of hit a limit, right? I mean, there's a CO2 limit. We've made the blanket of the atmosphere too thick, right? So we have to shrink that in the context of making more people happy. I tend to interpret the idea of growth rather than I think there are measurement issues with GDP. I tend to think of the idea of growth as increasing collective utility, and I would never, so in that sense, on principle, I wouldn't be in favor of degrowth. I think we should probably be trying to make people better off all the time. I think we could get into debates about whether we should sacrifice growth, as Westerners, right? Maybe we should have no growth while other people get a chance to experience more for a while, right? Maybe that entails, this gets to your point about degrowth, that we shrink. I think politically that it's hard enough to envision giving away wind turbines to countries that should not develop using fossil fuels. I think suggesting that we start sending huge swaths of our income to other places is a tough sell, especially in the current climate.
Political scientist at the end. Tough
Sorry,
sell.
dismal
Colleagues.
science. Dismal science.
So in terms of the food sovereignty question, there's, both La Via Campesina and the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance are working in North America and kind of our interconnected network of organizations, and I'm happy to connect you with them. In terms of religion, I will say that I studied liberation theology in college. I'm not actually Christian, but it was one of my most transformational learning processes, and kind of connected with my work around poverty and really motivated me. And I think it's actually, I'd love to turn this question back to this crowd of folks, which is in this time of growing polarization, in this time where there's swings to conservative, kind of interpretations of religion all over the world. How can we use a human rights space analysis or tools to kind of ground us in fundamental inalienable rights of people through and definitely using religious arguments along the way. But it's a very important challenge. And then I just wanted to end with kind of just a note on supporting work around defense. That just to say that for all of you that are connecting with academies, NGOs, and global networks, that defending some of the communities that are most at risk is very important, along with the work of innovation and evolution, right? And so thinking particularly of one of the campaigns I'm most closely connected to in the Pacific region, which is a campaign to make a moratorium on deep sea mining, which is essentially the practice of fracking the ocean floor, which could just fundamentally wipe out the ecosystems that so many people and beings rely on. And it's really, for me, become a symbol of yes, if it's called degrowth, to not frack the ocean floor, yes to degrowth, right? So there has to be a limit to destruction in the name of profit. And this is one of those times, right, that we can collectively stand up for our brothers and sisters in the Pacific who are really fighting harder on that issue. And there's so many other worthy fights along those lines. So I'd love to talk to any of you more about that as well.
JD, final word.
Final
and,
word. Very
thank
quick
you
final
all.
word. And yes, I was amazed you kept asking for more questions, because didn't we have enough to cover already? Okay, very quickly, because most of these thankfully have been covered. Now, the specific question on researching the role of religion, I'm not aware of any place where we're researching that, but I do know that in many of the countries and communities we work within, it's very clear that religion, religious belief, religious institutions, and religious networks as a form of identity are tremendously powerful. So if you're going to change the perception and the vision of what development means in a place like that, you've got to engage with religion in some way, both for the negative and the positive. Interestingly, you touched on another point there, which is religion is one of, I think, the few lenses through which you get people to think beyond the individual, and particularly on an intergenerational space. And I was just mulling this over when we were talking. Perhaps also one of the bits we didn't touch upon is that the notion of the individual versus the collective and the balance of that varies across the world depending on culture. It's expressed through religion or theology, philosophy, whatever. And that may also explain to some extent differences in the ability to be able to motivate society to do large transformative things. I'm rambling, sorry. Alison, the connections not being unknown. You're right, there are many places where we know them. And I'll go back actually to the throwaway comment I made earlier, which is that climate change is not a problem and neither is environmental degradation. They're not a problem, they're a symptom of a problem. They're a symptom of economic, social, political structures that predicate an unequal view of how development takes place. Unequal both in terms of who wins, who controls power, who controls resources, and unequal in terms of who loses, in terms of where the destruction of livelihoods, potential, the future takes place. And one of my sort of late night, this has gone on and I've had a very hard day, intuitions is many of the people who today hold power, whether it is political power or economic power, know perfectly well that the path of destruction we're on is not sustainable, but have a sense, right or wrong, that they control enough power and resources to make sure they're okay in the end. Yeah? So at the end of the day, when you come back to the question around rights and the contestation of rights, it's fundamentally, when you come right down to the brutal part of it, a contestation of power to ensure that everybody in the world has sufficient power, has sufficient control, has sufficient voice, has sufficient rights to make sure that everybody's needs are taken care of and the risk is shared equally. So whether you call it good governance, whether you call it rights, whatever you call it, at the end of the day, guys, this is all about power. Who holds power, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's power as virtue of being a religious voice or a cultural voice, whether it's power that's economic. And like it or not, end of the day, if you're serious about the kind of conversations we're having, you're going to have to go down to that level and say, you need to start looking at that conversation. not to simply say, let's burn everything down and spark a revolution, but to say we need to figure out a way of convincing people that a world in which we share and distribute power more equitably is actually a world in which we are all individually going to be happier. And I'll just end on a note, because you talked a little bit just now about working with some very rich people. I know an amazing number of very, very rich people who are deeply unhappy. You get to the point where you can convince them that there is a different societal structure where their sense of worth is not so much expressed in dollars, and they will be happier off in a world with less money. And I think we're moving in that direction. And interestingly, you know, there are many very rich people now who recognize that. That's the kind of space where you can get to. And when you get to that, then the environmental degradation, the climate change stuff, and all the rest gets taken care of. Because, guys, we know what the solutions are. CO2 emissions, the pathways we need to actually move back to staying under 2 degrees Celsius. We've known this for 20, 30 years. And I'm sorry if I sound a little bit frustrated, but that was my life work in UNDP for 20 years. We know how to do this stuff. That's not the problem. The problem is the systems and structures within which you're constrained to work. And beyond, I know Paul commented on this, beyond a certain level, you can only get so far by tweaking variables within the existing systems and structures. Until we get to the point where we all recognize we need to start creating a vision and a level of ambition that says there is a different system and a structure out there that makes all of us better off and happier. Until we get to that point, the rest of it is basically dealing with symptoms.
Great panel, thank you. Of course, all the human rights people just go, oh, JD, you're a human rights person now, because the human rights framework is that.
Don't tell my colleagues that.
Yes, exactly. Don't tell anybody UNDP was here saying some of these things. The whole UN system would think it's radical. Okay, thank you guys so much for your patience and for engaging with us. This was, wonderful for me. I hope it was useful for you all. Thank you. Thank you guys. Sorry.
Hi, a couple of announcements for the rest of the evening. There is a reception that's happening right now at the cafeteria, at the cafe. So you're welcome to go grab a drink and enjoy the beautiful